Good evening, everyone. Ooh, let's try. Good evening, everyone. Ah, thank you. My name is Sophia Nathawi, author event coordinator here at the Pratt Library, and thank you for joining us this evening. First, some housekeeping. Tonight will be a moderated conversation of 45 minutes, and the last 15 minutes will be Q&A from our audience. That's you. So if you have any questions, there are 2 mics on either sides of the room, and at the 45-minute mark will be time for anybody who has a question to come up to those mics and ask questions. Snug Books is selling books this evening, and there will be a signing at the table right outside at the end of the program, so if you get a copy of the book, you are eligible to get it signed. And so now, tonight's introduction. Tonight, I'm happy to welcome Jens Ludwig to the Pratt Library to discuss his book, Unforgiving Places, The Unexpected Origins of American Gun Violence. I ran out of air, sorry. In 2007, economist Jens Ludwig moved to the south side of Chicago to research 2 big questions. Why does gun violence happen? And is there anything we can do about it? Almost 2 decades later, the answers aren't what he expected. Unforgiving Places is Ludwig's revelatory portrait of gun violence in America's most famously maligned city. Disproving the popular narrative that shootings are the calculated acts of malicious or desperate people, Ludwig shows how most shootings actually grow out of a more fleeting source, interpersonal conflict, especially arguments. By examining why some arguments turn tragic while others don't, Ludwig shows gun violence to be more circumstantial and more solvable than our traditional approaches lead us to believe. Jens will be joined in conversation this evening by Baltimore Banner investigative reporter, Justin Fenton. Jens Ludwig is the Edwin A. and Betty L. Bergman Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy. He is the Pritzker Director of the University of Chicago's Crime Lab, co-director of the National Bureau of Economic Research's Working Group on the Economics of Crime, elected member of the National Academy of Medicine, and a member of the Committee on Law and Justice of the National Academies of Science. Justin Fenton is an investigative reporter for the Baltimore Banner. He previously spent 17 years at the Baltimore Sun, covering the criminal justice system. His book, We Own This City, A True Story of Crime, Cops, and Corruption, was released by Random House in 2021 and became an HBO miniseries. He was part of the Pulitzer Prize finalist team for coverage of the death of Freddie Gray and was a 2-time finalist for the National Livingston Award for Young Journalists. Publishers Weekly called Unforgiving Places meticulous and persuasive. This is a thought-provoking look at the deeply intertwined natures of income inequality and violence. Library Journal relayed that Ludwig makes the case that communities can reduce gun violence by fostering socially controlled, i.e. more bystanders or professionals to step in before confrontations escalate, and teaching people how to navigate fraught situations without resorting to violence. And Stephen Levitt, co-author of Freakonomics, commented, Ludwig thinks more deeply about the causes of American gun violence than anyone, and his policy situations have been proven to work. Unforgiving Places is the best book on American violence I've ever read. It is my great pleasure to welcome Jens Ludwig and Justin Fenton.
Okay, thanks everybody for coming out. I'm Justin Fenton from the Baltimore Banner, and with me is Jens Ludwig from University of Chicago. This book is important. Thank you for writing it. I think there's a lot of conversation around crime in this country, and it's based on a lot of misconceptions, and I think you go into depth about some things that people should think about and should affect public policy. I fear this isn't the right time in our country for people to listen to these kinds of things, but they should. And so I want to delve into it right now. Can you first tell us, why is an economist telling us about gun violence?
Yeah, I got into economics because I was interested in the idea of using data to understand what's going on with the world and how we can try and make it better. And then I kind of accidentally fell into getting interested in urban challenges, and gun violence is, at some level, the most important challenge for American cities. I moved in the fall of 2007 from Georgetown University to the University of Chicago. And that fall, there was a doctoral student from Senegal named Amadou Sis. He had just defended his doctoral dissertation in chemistry. So if you know anything about PhD programs at fancy universities, you don't pay to go, they pay you to go. And so 6 or 7 years before I got to the University of Chicago, Amadou Sis's family was getting a letter from the graduate school at the University of Chicago saying, congratulations, your kid has basically won the Willy Wonka golden ticket. You get a PhD from the University of Chicago in chemistry. It's one of the best chemistry departments in the world. You write your own ticket. He defends his dissertation in the fall of 2007, and 2 weeks after defending, he's coming home at 1:30 in the morning from an ice cream social when someone tries to rob him for his backpack and his water bottle, shoots him point blank in the chest with a stolen .22. They race him northbound on Lakeshore Drive. He's pronounced dead in the Northwestern ER. So maybe one thing to just take from that story is, you can imagine then, 6 or 7 years before that, his family gets the Willy Wonka golden ticket letter. And now the University of Chicago Graduate School is reaching out with whatever the opposite of that is. And just to remind us all, for starters, that behind every headline and every statistic, there's a mom who has just lost the most important person in their whole world. And in this case, I would also mention that the kid, I'll say kid, who shot him is a 17-year-old named Demetrius Warren, who's now spending 120 years downstate in the Illinois Department of Corrections. In this particular case, 2 moms lost the most important person in their whole worlds. So this led to a lot of conversation at the University of Chicago. We like to say we've won more Nobel Prizes than any other university in the world. And yet we can see this happened. Amadou Sis was shot about a block from my office on campus. We can see we're not having nearly enough impact literally in our own backyard. What can we do to be more helpful? The National Academy of Sciences had just come out and said, reviewing all of the data and evidence about what we know about preventing gun violence in America, the conclusion is nothing. And I thought, this is what a great urban research university should be working on. And this is essentially a data and science problem, and economists, someone's got to work on this, and we might as well see if we can be helpful.
Can you give us a little bit of the lay of the land of the problem with gun violence in Chicago? I think Baltimore is well known for our challenges with it over the years. But Chicago seems to always be in the news. You have a high number of gun violence, but a big city, so the numbers are just often eye-popping. Give me a sense of sort of how Chicagoans view the issue.
Yeah, the Chicago has the largest number of murders in the United States because we're the biggest unsafe city in the country. If you look at the murder rate per capita in Chicago, we're about middle of the pack. Somewhere around Washington, D.C., somewhere lower than the city of Baltimore. And in many ways, I think the Chicago story is very similar to most cities where the gun violence is very, very strongly geographically concentrated. The way that I often describe Chicago is Manhattan with Detroit glued on to the south, and St. Louis or Baltimore, another city with similar levels of gun violence, sort of glued onto the west. And so the gun violence impact on people's lives really depends a lot on where you live, but I don't know if this is true to the same extent in Baltimore. Since the pandemic, the gun violence problem has been diffusing much more throughout the city, and especially carjackings, I think, has really created a sense of deep unsafety. Maybe the one other thing that I would say, just in terms of stage setting, is I think Chicago right now is experiencing the same sort of surprisingly large declines in gun violence that Baltimore and many other cities around the country are experiencing. And maybe one way to bring home how to think, or how I've come to, a reminder of how to think about the problem, let me say that, was I spent the month of August for work in Australia and then Japan. The murder rate in Australia is 1 per 100,000. The murder rate in Japan is 0.2 per 100,000. I was giving a talk to government officials about the violence problem there. And in passing, I said, the murder rate in Chicago is 22 per 100,000. And several government officials audibly gasped. And it's just a reminder that what has become normal in the United States is truly abnormal when you look around the world at any other rich country doesn't know anything like the violence problem that we have here.
Yeah, just some data I was looking at this morning. Chicago's homicide rate in 2024 was 22 per 100,000 people, but a total of 573 victims. But that's down 28% from 2021, when there were 804 fatal victims. Baltimore last year had 35 killings per 100,000, so much higher. We had 201 total, but that's down 42% from our 2019 peak of 348 victims. So, I mean, these are tremendous declines, but still too high. You spend some of the early parts of the book talking about what doesn't drive violence, namely that incurable evil psychopaths and profit-driven motives are not the main drivers, but that persists in people's minds sort of falsely as the underpinnings of violence. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think when I moved to Chicago, I had the same image of the gun violence problem in my head that I think survey data suggests most Americans have. So if you look at the survey data for the last 50 years, Americans sort themselves basically into two camps in terms of explaining why gun violence happens. So a bunch of people think that the problem is due to morally bad people who are just not afraid of whatever the criminal justice system is going to do to them. And that leads people to the conclusion that the only thing that you can do to solve the gun violence problem is to threaten people with ever bigger sticks, ever bigger prison punishments. And that turns out to be something that the United States is very good at doing, as we've all seen since the 1970s. The set of people who don't believe that conventional wisdom almost all fall into a different camp that thinks that the gun violence problem is driven by economically desperate people doing whatever it takes to feed their families. And that perspective on the problem leads you to think that the only thing that you can do is disincentivize gun violence by making the alternatives to crime much more lucrative. If we give someone a better job, access to a more generous social program, that's gonna lead them to choose to not engage in crime and do something else instead. And it's interesting, given how bitter the political fights are around this issue, like many issues, that the left and the right on this issue, those conventional wisdoms conform to the left and right of the political spectrum. The conventional wisdoms share an implicit assumption about the problem, which is before anybody pulls a trigger, they're thinking in sort of a deliberate way to weigh the pros and cons about what's going to happen before they pull the trigger. And I think that really, I have discovered, or I think I've discovered in the work that we've been doing in the city of Chicago, that's where the conventional wisdom sort of goes off track.
Yeah, I was looking, again, to localize things. I was looking at, every year at the end of the year, I asked the Baltimore Homicide Unit they do this homicide analysis sheet where they break down the demographics and things like that. And for the motive, there were 263 cases in 2023. Argument was the leading motive at 22 of 263 cases. Drug dispute was 2, robbery was 7, financial gain, rape, gang-motivated carjacking, burglary combined 0. Unknown was the motive for 209 of the 263. And I think you talk about this. Often they'll sort of characterize a case as drug-related or gang-related when really it just involves people who are adjacent to drugs and gangs. It actually had nothing to do with the motive whatsoever. And it's that split-second interpersonal dispute that was actually the reason for it.
Yeah, I think the reason that I think all of us, including I put myself front in line, had the wrong mental image of the gun violence problem is that the information that we get about gun violence in the United States is not representative of what most shootings are, right? And so, in the city of Chicago, the local U.S. attorney is, every time they do a racketeering case against one of these drug-selling gangs in Chicago, like the Wicked Town Vice Lords. They killed something like 20 people over a period of 2 or 3 years as part of some war over drug corners on the west side along the 290 Eisenhower Expressway, the heroin highway that they call it, connecting downtown to the suburbs. Like, that is on the front page of the Chicago Tribune every day for 2 weeks. It gets a huge amount of attention. When a University of Chicago graduate student is shot and killed, Amadou Sis made the front page of the New York Times, right? When 2 people get into an argument, that makes page A56, if that. When we started the crime lab to try and be helpful to the city of Chicago in figuring out what to do about the problem, we sent my friend Harold Pollack into the basement of the Chicago police headquarters at 35th and Michigan on the south side of the city. We said, Harold, you're not allowed to come out until you've read every homicide case file involving a victim or a shooter under 18. And Harold came back and he said, this problem is not what we thought. Like, very consistent with you, so he's looking not just at he's looking at the hunches for the detectives, even if they're not willing to put it, and he's like, most of these things look like, we are getting into it in the moment over whatever, and it's escalating in an ending tragedy because someone's got a gun. And our policies assume deliberate behavior. So for 100 years, we've been thinking about how can we change the incentives that deliberate, premeditating people are engaging in. But if that's not what people are actually doing, no wonder our policies haven't had a bigger impact. And you can see it's not just that our murder rate is so much higher than what you see in other developed countries. Our murder rate today in the United States is not that different from what it was in 1900. Unlike most other leading causes of death, which have plummeted on a per capita basis since 1900. So we've been arguing back and forth about bigger sticks, bigger carrots, and that back and forth just is not leading to any progress. And so I hope the book gives us a new way to see the problem that might inject some new ideas and a new conventional wisdom that give us a new direction to go in.
Let's get into some behavioral economics. Talk about system 1, the concept of system 1 and system 2 responses, because that's a big part of understanding these concepts.
Yeah, so I think for me, I was trained back in the 1890s as a garden variety economist. This was so long ago, there was no such thing as behavior. Behavioral economics is the recognition that psychology has something to teach us about human behavior. So economists sort of losing a little bit of their imperialism and recognizing that we have something to learn from other fields. And I think one of the biggest insights for me about I think one of the biggest insights of all social science about human behavior is that our minds don't work the way we think they do. So we think about thinking as the little voice in our head, right? And that, to the extent to which we are ever premeditated and deliberate and rational and thinking carefully through pros and cons, that is a little voice in our head that gives us the capacity to do that. But that's only one of 2 types of thinking that we actually engage in. So psychologists call that voice in our head system 2 thinking or slow thinking. And it's amazingly powerful. It's how we put a man on the moon, how we invented the internet. But it's super mentally taxing. Like, if you're a crossword puzzle aficionado, you do 15 minutes of the crossword, and then you're just exhausted, you have to take a break. That is system 2 showing how mentally taxing it is. So all of our minds have developed a very different type of thinking that happens below the level of consciousness. Fast thinking, system 1 thinking, if you've read Malcolm Gladwell's Blink, if you've read Danny Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, that's what all of these books are about, is how much of our behavior is driven by these automatic responses that we have all developed that occur really fast, below the level of consciousness, automatically, we're not even aware of them, they're almost involuntary, that help us navigate day-to-day situations that we engage in. They're useful. We couldn't live without system 1, but they can get us into huge amounts of trouble when they're overgeneralized into unhelpful situations. And the argument of the book is that we've thought of gun violence as a system 2 slow thinking problem, and it's actually much more of a system 1 fast thinking problem than we've appreciated.
And this book is full of examples of this mild-mannered man flying off the handle in tense situations. But I mean, it's really instructive, though, because you help apply that to like how someone who's maybe in a different situation than you ends up shooting somebody. Can you give one of those examples?
Yeah, so I think there are two really important arguments that I wanted to try and make in the book, which is, one is that all of our minds essentially work exactly the same. The architecture of our minds is exactly the same. And so sort of the cognitive stuff that I'm describing in the book is not specific to any particular group of people. It's truly universal. The main thing that differentiates us is the circumstances in which we find ourselves. That determines the severity of the consequences. And then the second key point I think that I really want to make about the behavioral economics of this is I think the big breakthrough of behavioral economics was not to point out that people make mistakes, but rather that the mistakes that we make have some predictable structure to it, which gives us a chance to figure out what to do about it. And so let me just give you one example from the book. For 18 years, I lived on the south side of Chicago in Hyde Park, where the University of Chicago is located. And every Wednesday morning, I would take my dog. I've got a 70-pound German Shepherd Hound Dog mix named Aiko. She's a lover, not a fighter. I would leash her up, put on my sneakers, put on my headset, and do my weekly leadership team call with the top people at my research center at the University of Chicago Crime Lab. And so one morning, I'm walking Aiko around Hyde Park, and we pass by a house, and I hear the most blood-curdling, shrieking, barking, whatever. And I turn and look, and racing down this driveway at me is a giant dog, some sort of Irish setter, something or other off leash. And one thing I realized in that moment is that evolution designed dogs to look petrifying when they want to look petrifying. Fangs bared, spit flying out of the dog's mouth, it's flying down the driveway, it is making like the most blood-curdling like noises you can imagine. And the other thing that I could see was the owner of the dog running frantically after it down the driveway. And it also turned out that that the owner of the dog was another faculty member at the University of Chicago in the hospital. And worse than that, his kids go to my kids' school. And worse than that still, his kids are in my kids' grade. So this is someone I'm going to see in the, in the back to school potluck line for years and years in the future. So the system two rational part of my brain, here's what the rational part of my brain would have thought. I would have realized immediately, for starters, that surely this was an accident, right? Why would this guy intentionally sick his dog on my dog? The dog slipped its leash somehow. He's trying to fix the problem by running after it. That's thing one, so it's not intentional. Thing two is I would have realized the worst thing in the world is to get into it with this guy, right? Because like, what could be more mortifying than a neighbor, a parent at the same school? And I would have realized there are tons of different solution strategies that I could have stood between me and Aiko. I could have picked Aiko up. She's big, but not so big that I couldn't have picked her up in emergency. We take her to the vet all the time anyway. What's one more vet visit, whatever. That part of my mind was nowhere to be found in the moment. So, one of the things that has been very helpful over human evolution, this speaks to the predictable structure of system one thing that's been very helpful to us over the long arc of human evolution is system one very quickly and effortlessly assesses the situation for us, and it does that in a very binary way. That's part of the trade-off of fast and effortless is accuracy. And so system one looks at a situation and says, I'm going to classify this into one of two categories, fine or the end of the world. And having a dog tear down the driveway at your dog about to attack certainly is not fine, which left system one with end of the world. And once you think that my dog getting attacked is the end of the world, by construction, anything is better than the worst thing that could happen. So what I actually did is I used every 4-letter, 7-letter, and 12-letter word I learned growing up in New Jersey at the top of my lungs at this pediatric surgeon at the University of Chicago. I might as well just, I have friends in the audience who are saying, I don't know this person up here. And And then, from his perspective, like there's another thing that System 1 does very predictably. When System 1 forms the theory of a mind of another person, it sets a default, like what is the fastest, most effortless default for what is in your head? It's what is in my head. So System 1 sets an anchor, you know everything that I know, and then System 2 slow thinking can adjust that, but since System 2 slow thinking is mentally taxing, we're always under adjusting. We're always assuming that other people know more of the things that we know than they actually do. So he's looking at me thinking this guy must know that this is an accident. And his response to what he clearly knows is an accident is to say these horribly profane things at the top of his lungs in front of my house when my wife and little kids are in there having breakfast. So the thing to reflect on here is this is characteristic of most violence. Both of the parties involved are convinced they're the good guys. It's a very, very important feature of conflict that gets escalated. Like, it is not someone who thinks of themselves as a bad guy and someone who thinks of themselves as a good guy. This escalates. This guy is like 2 inches from, I'm screaming at him, he's 2 inches from my face screaming at me. I look at my 70-pound dog, Aiko, she's just looking around at the squirrels. I'm like, thanks, buddy, for the help. And the only thing that saved us, and then this sort of previews now what we can do about it, is the University of Chicago has hired a bunch of private security guards to patrol around the neighborhood. One of them happened to be driving by, rolls down the window, sees these 2 super embarrassing middle-aged men screaming at each other at the top of their lungs and says, is everything all right here, or should I call a University of Chicago cop? And that is the thing that interrupted the spell, the System 1 spell that we had both been on in the moment, right? Luckily, neither one of us had a gun. Luckily, what Jane Jacobs would have called an eye on the street, someone in the community paying attention, willing to step in and interrupt, saved us from this going totally sideways. And part of the argument of the book is lots of teenagers in disadvantaged neighborhoods all over Chicago don't have the benefit of an eye on the street who can step in and break things up.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about that. So you talk about how there's some neighborhoods that have similar underlying demographics and challenges, and yet you'll see different rates of gun violence. Why is that? What are some of the factors?
Yeah, I think, one of the things, so in the book I use the example of just south of Hyde Park on the south side of Chicago, there are 2 neighborhoods, Greater Grand Crossing and South Shore, separated by Dorchester Avenue. And the poverty rates are exactly the same, the gun laws are exactly the same, the demographics of the neighborhood are the same, the criminal justice system is the same. So all of the conventional wisdom explanations give you no way to understand why there's twice as many shootings per capita in Greater Grand Crossing than in South Shore. And part of the explanation is that South Shore has the advantage of lying right alongside the best thing in Chicago, which is Lake Michigan. And because of that, historically, from 100 whatever years ago, more commercial stuff has developed in South. The poverty rates are the same, but all the stores are in South Shore, not in Greater Grand Crossing. So there's just way more people walking around, going to the local whatever. So when groups of teenagers are getting into arguments and whatever, there are more neighborhood residents around to step it in. And the second thing that I would just point to is Greater Grand Crossing just has way more stressors than South Shore does. If you look at like 311 calls for graffiti, if you look at the amount of litter on the streets, if you use machine learning to look at the analyze the Google Street Views of the block faces in Greater Grand Crossing. If you look at how hard COVID hit Greater Grand Crossing relative to South Shore. And the reason that those stressors are important is remember that System 2 is mentally taxing. So anything that is going to impose like a mental bandwidth tax on you is going to lead everyone to be just a little bit more reliant on System 1, which means in these fraught moments, like this deliberate thinking is just a little bit harder to find. And I think that helps us understand why the problem varies so much across neighborhoods. It's not that there's anything fundamentally different about the people, and then also starts to give us a sense for, so what could we be doing about it?
Yeah, I'm always struck by how in some of Baltimore has a tremendous issue with blight, and I'm always struck by how many people die in neighborhoods where so few people live. But you speak to that there's not eyes on the street, that these add to the different factors at play. So, I mean, with that, it's about split-second decisions, not thought-out, plotted gang crimes. That there's the ways to impact them are different. You said a lot of our political fights over crime and criminal justice are about what the right punishment is for someone after they've committed a crime. That's a genuinely difficult question about which reasonable people will inevitably disagree. But preventing gun violence in the first place sidesteps that issue entirely and is something that everyone should be able to get behind. Talk about problem solving, community violence interrupters, things like that.
Yeah, so I think everybody, it's easy to forget from the perspective of 2025, but up until the 1970s, everybody agreed that crime prevention was the best way to deal with the problem. And then in the 1970s, we took stock of everything that we'd been learning from social science up to that point, and people became very pessimistic. We've just been trying the wrong things. Nothing had worked, and I think people overgeneralized from the discouraging evidence to conclude that you just can't prevent crime, and that's led then to the fork that we've had. I think I spend a lot of time talking to people running cities that are A, grappling with the gun violence problem, and B, have absolutely no money to address it, no additional money to address it. So I don't know what the Baltimore City budget situation is like, but the mayor of Chicago right now is in the middle of budget season trying to figure out how he's gonna fill a $1.2 billion with a B budget deficit for this upcoming fiscal year. So nobody's sitting around in Chicago thinking, how can we throw more money at the problem of solving gun violence? People are asking, where are the painful cuts going to come? And so I would just maybe add, building on your question, I think one of the exciting things about the behavioral economics perspective on the problem is that there's a bunch of very technocratic stuff that we can do that gets us out of these political food fights and that can be really low cost. So for instance, this is gonna feel like a weird tangent, but it's related to the question. So when you talk to poker players, professional poker players will tell you that one of the first things that they learned about how to get better at poker is they realized that, poker is all about counting cards and analytically thinking about the patterns of other people's play and everything. And sometimes poker players, because they're human beings, just get pissed off. Something goes wrong, they get pissed off. And poker players, when they start playing emotionally, they call it going on tilt. With a pinball machine, if you're playing pinball and you smack it, you lift it up, it gives you an on tilt error message. Poker players realize that they get frustrated, they play on tilt, they do very badly. They realize, I've got to stop doing that. And poker players will say, I learned to get better at that. So that's like a learnable thing. So, we were working with a few years ago, so why is this relevant to gun violence? A few years ago, the Juvenile Temporary Detention Center on the west side of Chicago, which is where all the juveniles in Chicago get arrested, that the system thinks they're at super high risk of violence, so they get detained there awaiting trial. A new administrator came in to run the place. We talking to him about what he was gonna do to make it better, and he's like, the kids, they go to school in the morning, in the afternoon, they're sitting in a common room watching TV while a guard stands against the wall watching the kids watch TV. He said, we have to be able to do something more developmentally productive than watching TV. And so he basically started training the guards to deliver essentially a behavioral economics type program to teach the kids to recognize what sets them off and puts them on tilt, how to recognize that, and how to bring themselves back down, and we structured that like a randomized trial, like you have in medicine, so we're pretty confident in the result, and that free intervention reduced recidivism rates among these super high for violence risk kids by 20%. Now, 20% might seem like a big effect, it might seem like a small effect, but remember that this intervention is basically free. Give me 5 things that reduce violence by 20% each, and they're each free. I think we're really talking about something. And then I think the other thing that we could imagine doing, I'll just say is everybody is aware that there is a huge abundance conversation in the United States right now. Why does government make it so hard to clean up vacant lots, to fix up abandoned houses, to zone in retail. In Chicago, it's corruption, but in other cities, there's a lot of regulations that make it hard to like open a new store in a low-income neighborhood, whatever. And I think another way to think about this is like, to the extent to which this abundance agenda takes off, let the abundance agenda start in the most disadvantaged neighborhoods. That would help a huge amount in supporting eyes on the street, because we have an amazing collection of randomized experiments and natural experiment data that show that each one of these things on their own, cleaning up a vacant lot reduces shootings by 10, 20, 30%. Opening up a store in a neighborhood around the vicinity reduces shootings by 10, 20, 30%. Like, you do a bunch of these sort of changes to the built environment, you do that, plus you run free social programs in detention facilities where almost everybody involved in gun violence will pass at some point, and you start to see a nearly free agenda that can really start to make a difference.
And you talk about how police are a part of this. You're not saying that we don't need police. In fact, police can help. They can be part of the interruption. Talk about the role of the criminal justice system and police in this environment.
Yeah, I think one of the, so when we started the crime lab, we wanted to be like the R&D partner for the city. And one of the key agencies that works on public safety in Chicago is the police department. And I was like, I don't know anything about policing. I grew up watching Hill Street Blues, but surely there's more to it than that. So somehow we convinced the superintendent of the Chicago Police Department to let me go around with the gang homicide team on the South Side and try and just learn more about the problem. And one of the things that was really eye-opening for me, for starters, is the police themselves don't really understand what it is about policing that reduces violence. And in fairness to the police, it's a really, really hard inferential problem. They're doing a bunch of things, like, what is it that really matters? And here's, I think, the tell for how you can tell the police don't know. Right, which is, you were saying backstage, over 15 years, Baltimore has had 7 police superintendents. I've been living in Chicago now for 18 years, and I think at last count, we've had something like 16 police superintendents. And almost the best predictor of what the next police superintendent's agenda is going to be is like this superintendent's agenda, the opposite of that. Right? And so in a world in which everybody is just reversing their predecessor, it can't be that they know what they're doing and they're all working off the same sort of playbook. I say that because I've seen police superintendents come in and say we should just be arresting everybody. And others come in and say we need to be doing this thing or that. There's just a lot of fads and whatever. People are just flailing around. And I think the key insight of the book in many ways was we were in the detention facility and a staff member there said 20% of the kids in here are psychopaths. If you let them out, they're going to hurt other people. The other 80%, I always say, if I can give you back just 10 minutes of your lives, none of you would be here. And what that highlights is the huge power of interruption in the same way that security guard did with me and the neighbor. And I think that is a hugely underappreciated thing that cops do. I'll just tell you 2 quick stories, if I can, about that. One of them, one of the most heartbreaking, as someone with 2 daughters, one of the most heartbreaking examples of this, I was driving around with the sergeant on the gang homicide team super late one night, 2, 3 in the morning in an unmarked little Chevy SUV, and we turned the corner, and there's a woman pinned against a chain link fence holding a little kid's hand, and this big guy, 3 inches from her face, just screaming like you would not believe. And the sergeant gets out and says, "What's going on?" And the guy turns and said, "Everything's fine." And the sergeant says, "Buddy, I think you should take a walk." And the guy says, "I said everything's fine." And the sergeant says, "I think you should take a fucking walk." And the guy got the message, and then we give the lady a ride home. Absent intervention in that case, there's no question in my mind that someone would have been at the very least beat up. And you can imagine you put a gun in that situation and many of those turn into tragedies. Just one other example that has the same flavor that is more of what we think of as the gun violence problem. I'm in the back of a car, Friday night call, 2 groups of people arguing in the middle of the street, lights, sirens, they're going 80 miles an hour over the surface streets through all the red lights, stop signs, we show up. Some girl living on one side of the street had been dating a teenage boy on the other side of the street. Somebody in the girl's family thought it would be a great idea. They broke up. Somebody in the girl's family thought it would be a great idea to walk across the street, walk into the boy's house, and punch him in front of all of his family members. So they're in the middle of the street. Everybody is arguing. It's a huge fiasco. The cops say, everybody get in your house. If we have to come back, all y'all are going to jail. That is interruption of a sort, right? And the other thing that highlights, because anticipating another sort of direction where you might go on the solutions, it highlights the power of the police to do acute intervention in the moment, right? You need, when there are 30 people in a brawl or some guy who's like, I'm not leaving this lady who I'm about to beat the shit out of, you need a cop in a bulletproof vest with a taser and a gun to be like, this is done. We could do this the easy way or the hard way, but this is over. And then, but we get back into the car in the brawl and we're driving away and I say to the sergeant, like, you think this is over? He's like, oh, no, this is, there's gonna be another call here tonight for sure. I was like, why are we leaving then? He said, are you listening to the police radio? This is a Friday night on the south side of Chicago. Like every 15 minutes is a man with a gun or a shots fired call. Like we just cannot sit around here for hours trying to, and I think this is why I think in Baltimore and other American cities, everybody has heard of community violence intervention, which makes no sense under the conventional wisdom that violence is due to morally bad people or bad economic conditions. Community violence intervention is not solving either of those problems. But if you think about the cops breaking up the fight in the middle of the street, this girl's family has to figure out a way to live across the street from this boy's family, or this is going to be the Hatfields and the McCoys. The cops can put out the fire in the moment, but that has to be complemented by somebody going in there and sort of figuring this out. And I think that highlights the potential of community violence intervention to be a hugely important complement to what the police do too.
Yeah, there's so many factors. I think about this stuff all the time. In Baltimore, we had 100,000 arrests in 2005, about 280 murders. The number of police on the force is at an all-time low, as low as anyone can remember. They're arresting 13,000 people a year, but we're seeing these tremendous declines. And 5 years ago, they would have said that was the issue. Here we are now, so there's a lot going on. I mentioned earlier that I feel like the climate in this country, the Trump administration has so much talk about punitive actions and sending in the guard and bad people who are irredeemable. Are we going to be able to get some of these ideas through, or do you think it's sufficiently insulated by local policy? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say maybe I would say maybe two things. One thing that I would say is we spend a lot of time going around the country talking to people at the city and state level about how we can be helpful, how they're thinking about addressing this problem. And when you talk to mayors and you talk to governors worrying about this problem, a lot of the performative aspects of policy at the federal level look very different. We talk to blue city mayors, we talk to red state governors, and everyone is like, I do not like, if I'm a governor, I'm a mayor, I get a text every morning or a call every morning that tells me how many people have been shot the night before, who they are, under what circumstances. No governor or mayor likes that. So we found a huge amount of receptivity to technocratic, pragmatic things that they can actually do. And the other thing that I would just say is, my read of this, if you look at, James Q. Wilson is a very famous political scientist who I argue in the book was one of the key intellectual architects of what many people have come to call mass incarceration. I know that term itself is whatever, the very high levels of incarceration we've seen in the United States now. He was the guy who sort of said, prevention doesn't work, we need to just lock people up, that's the only thing you can do. And when you go back and look at what James Q. Wilson was saying in the 70s, he was very open to the possibility of crime prevention, he just thought it wasn't possible. So I don't think, I have never seen a principled argument or even an unprincipled argument against crime prevention. It is really just skepticism that it's possible. And so one of the things that I hope the book does is it provides a framework for thinking about why prevention really is much more feasible than we've long thought because we've been trying the wrong things, and then provides randomized trial after. I'm just trying to beat skeptical readers over the head with randomized trial evidence that says this is not left-wing wishful thinking that you really can prevent crime, rehabilitate people who've been in the criminal justice system. Like, this is very hard-headed science that if followed, I think has the potential to do a lot of social good.
We said we would take questions at 7:45. I am out of questions. It is 7:45. We're doing great. All right, anybody have questions? We have a microphone set up over there.
Yes. If you have a question, you can go to this mic where
that
I'm
one
at
too.
and the one on the other side of the room as well. I will kick us off with an online question, which is, do you believe it is possible for gun violence to reach the levels you mentioned in Japan or Australia? How can we get there? A light start.
Yeah. So, I think it will be very hard to get Australian or Japanese homicide rates in a country with 400 million guns and 330 million people. Those guns are not going in anywhere anytime soon, and national gun laws, I'm not a political forecaster, but I'm going to guess that national gun laws are not going to change dramatically, at least for the next few years. So I think it will be very hard to reach Australia or Japan levels. But with that said, the way that I've come to think about the problem of gun violence is gun violence equals guns plus violence. It's not just gun availability, but the willingness of people to use guns to hurt one another. And if you look at what happened in 1991 at the peak of the crack cocaine epidemic, the murder rate in Chicago, LA, and New York, all three had about the same murder rates, 30 per 100,000. Remember, in Australia, it's 1, and Japan, it's 0.2. So just to remind us how insane 30 per 100,000 is. And in the 30 years after that, the murder rate dropped by 80% in LA and 90% in New York. And those cities are also islands swimming in an ocean of widely available guns that easily pass over city and state borders. And so I think that helps you get a sense for, so we might not reach Australia or Japan levels, but the huge drops in LA and New York that nobody would ever have imagined possible shows us that in a world in which the gun politics are just stuck for better or for worse, depending on your personal politics, we can still make a major difference on the problem by worrying about the violence side of the equation. So I hope that's like ultimately an optimistic perspective on the problem in a world in which you have lots and lots of reason to be pessimistic.
Yeah, in Baltimore, I'm feeling optimistic in the sense that the numbers have dropped so much that it feels like more can be done. Like it's propulsive. It's going to snowball. Like with fewer cases to have to deal with, you can spend more time trying to deal with the cases that you have and reduce those. And it feels like the success is just building on itself.
And if I can just add to that as well, I think the other part of that I would add as well. That's totally true. And I would also add that my University of Chicago colleague Steve Levitt wrote a paper many years ago showing that every murder that happens in a city reduces the city's population by, I think, on net 70 people. People leaving, fewer people moving in. Chicago's lost 1 million people since 1950. It's not all due to gun violence, but gun violence plays a big part of that if Steve's estimates are right. And so you can see how reducing the gun violence problem can arrest that vicious cycle and give you a chance to turn it into a virtuous cycle, right? The murder rate goes down, more people are willing to come in or stay, more businesses are willing to come in or stay. That gives you more eyes on the street, gives you more tax revenue to start to address all of these problems. That helps reduce the gun violence problem even more, and so on. That would be the hope, that we can kick that flywheel into the good direction from the bad direction.
Hi, good evening, Professor and Mr. Fenton. My name is Quinlan Murphy. I'm a recent law graduate, and I'm a clerk at the Baltimore City State's Attorney's Office in the Homicide Unit. I should say nothing in my questions should be imputed as the opinion of the state's attorney or the state's attorney's office. And I will say, I am also feeling optimistic, which is nice feeling. I have sort of a 3-part question, and feel free to address as much or as little of this as you choose. And you sort of preempted it a little bit with the last question about the availability of guns in the United States, but obviously in the last 20 years, the Supreme Court, there's been a series of decisions. I'm not going to get into the technical nitty-gritty, but basically the right to carry a firearm is now a constitutional right that's imputed against all of the states. And that has I think, increased people's legal ability to carry a gun. So my first question is, have you seen that in your data, that data point of like maybe 10 years ago when when those opinions first started coming down, increasing the effect of actual violence? My second question is, and this is not, that's more objective, like that is a legal change that happened. And this one's a little more subjective. When I was a kid here 30 years ago, you got this idea of urban gun violence, and you had the idea of somebody's stolen .38 special taken out of a truck. You know, it had thousands of rounds going through it. It fired only 6 shots. And it just isn't that good of a gun, fundamentally. And now, when people are arrested with firearms in Baltimore City, they're often carrying a relatively new polymer framed or similar striker fired, very modern handgun, often with large capacity magazines. And those are simply, having shot both of those kinds of guns, the second category is simply better if your objective is to shoot another human being. And I wonder if you've seen that in the data that those pieces of technology fundamentally have made city streets more dangerous. And my third is sort of on your abundance point, because I am an abundance bro. And I'm curious what you think those $0 cost abundance agendas. In Baltimore, in the Freddie Gray uprisings 11 years ago, we obviously saw many businesses that were either damaged badly and those businesses chose to left, or those businesses were just destroyed. And I think you lose some of that eyes on the street of the normal citizen when that kind of event happens. So do you have any idea? I think you've really well illustrated sort of the policies you can use on your target population, but what are the policies we can use to investors or businesses or even community groups to sort of try to gather in the parts of the city that might have a beneficial effect? Thank you.
Let me, I'll say a little bit about all three. You know, I think one thing that's really interesting about federal gun policy in the US, it's obviously different across different cities and states, but if you look at federal gun policy, the way it's designed is to make guns super easy for most people to get, and ideally hard for just an identifiable subset of people to get, like underage people, people with disqualifying felony convictions or disqualifying histories of mental problems or whatever. You can see implicit, or maybe not even implicit, explicit in that sort of federal regulatory system is this idea that the world can be divided up into good guys and bad guys. It's like, all of you are at zero risk for using a gun, have at it. And there's a bunch of bad guys that we can sort of easily pick out, and they're the only ones who would do anything wrong, and so we're gonna, and I think that spills over to this idea of like concealed carry, like the shift towards increasingly liberalized concealed carry. It's like we know who the potential misusers are and who the potential misusers are. And I think that just deeply understands human nature, right? Like, I am so grateful that I was not carrying a gun when I got into it with this neighbor. I'm so grateful that he was not carrying a gun, right? And like, these are two University of Chicago, I mean, we have a reputation for being a sharp-elbowed university, so maybe that's not the right example, but it's like, the world is just not as sort of neatly divided up in that way. And so I think you can see in the data that the shift towards increasingly liberalized concealed carry is causing some of these problems. I think that in terms of the change I'll just say one more answer, and then we can go to other questions. To me, I think the biggest, most worrisome change in guns on the street that I think we're seeing in Chicago and other cities around the country is not so much the gun itself, although I take your point that the gun quality has gotten a lot better. It is the growing availability of, so if you're not sort of a gun whatever, you know, in the 1930s, Franklin Delano Roosevelt banned machine guns, where you hold the trigger down and the gun automatically fires so long as the trigger is pulled. And so since the 1930s, you were only allowed to have a semi-automatic handgun that would fire once for every trigger pull. And recently, some evil genius has come up with a $20 plastic switch called the Glock switch that you can, or a machine gun conversion device, if you want to use the jargony term for it, that you can install in like 5 seconds and it turns your semi-automatic handgun into effectively a machine gun. Combined with the expiration of the assault weapons ban at the national level that now lets you have a drum, like a magazine that holds up to 100 rounds. And so I've been with the cops when they pulled kids over with a handgun, a Glock switch, and a 100-round drum clipped to the bottom of their semi-automatic. And when you see a firearm with a Glock switch, like I was recently with the prosecutor in Cook County at a demonstration where they had a guy from ATF put a Glock switch onto a semi-automatic handgun. And this is like some huge expert ATF guy who fired it on fully automatic, and you could see the gun just drifts up with an ATF guy firing this, right? And so then, you have a 15-year-old kid with a 100-round drum and a Glock switch. So we're seeing in Chicago the number of shots fired per shootings go up. We're seeing the number of people injured per shooting go up. We're seeing the number of injuries per victim go up. And we're seeing the shooting fatality rate go up in Chicago. And by an amount that is enough to like increase the number of homicides that we're having by 50, 100, 150 compared to if the shooting fatality rate had been the same as back in 2010. So that is a huge underappreciated problem that I hope that cities and states will be able to take care of absent some federal attention on this problem.
We have time for 2 more questions, and it's going to be the 2 questions right behind me.
As someone who loves living in Baltimore and is very thankful for the direction our city's going as far as gun crime goes, is there a way that we can be interrupters if we see something in the street? And do you have any advice for what the best thing is to do or say?
Yeah, what I would say is there's a life cycle to every violent event, and like during the early, I was visiting my daughter in Arizona recently, and there was like some guy on his bike and some lady who had like cut him off, and they're like just screaming at each other. Like that is the life cycle where like lots of people can step in and say, is there anything I can do to be helpful and sort this out, right? You can see as the event gets more and more heated, you will need something like a community violence interrupter or a cop to step in.
So it sort of depends on where it is in the life cycle of the event. Like if it's happened right away, maybe anybody could step in.
All of these things start as garden variety arguments.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? And like at that point, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, so my question isn't that good. As you talked about system 1 and system 2 thinking, that it seems like it would graft, like intuitively it grafts very easily onto a kind of a maturity sort of perspective, that system 1 sounds like impulsive, young, hot-headed. System 2 sounds like mature, level-headed, composed. And you've already said in your own sort of experience that nobody's immune from system 1, system 2 thinking, but just because I think there's already a tendency among folks to kind of over-attribute violence to young people as opposed to adults. Could you just say a little more about sort of the relationship between that system 1, system 2 framework and kind of adult versus juvenile, or sort of maturity versus immaturity?
Yeah, I think that what I would say is what I feel very confident in the science behind is that these programs are really helpful in reducing violence. And what I would say is that we're a little bit less clear on exactly what the mechanisms are for why. You were definitely right. I have a neuroscience friend who, the way he put it is like the cruel joke that nature has played on us is the gas pedal of the brain, the risk-seeking part of the brain turns on in early adolescence, and the brake pedal of executive functioning is not fully developed until your mid-20s. So if you have a teenager, as I now have two of, you'll be very familiar with that sort of pattern. So there's definitely something to maturation, but there's also something to experience, right? And so, and you know, if you think about how people learn anything, it's through trial and error. And, you know, if you're a 15-year-old kid who's living in a neighborhood where like guns, gangs, and drugs are very common, trial and error is a very, very costly way to learn anything. And so, you know, the programs that I was describing, like helping people recognize when they go on tilt, a lot of what they do is put people into simulated situations. And what it's basically doing is it's giving people repetitions, like that are simulated and so low stakes. And you can think about them as basically trying to like accelerate the maturation process. And so you're right that the problem is disproportionately concentrated among young people and violence rates evolve as people get older. You know, waiting for people to get older does not seem like the ideal solution. And so I think these sorts of programs that I think we really do have a chance to do at low cost, I think can play a really important complement to what nature does as well. Thank you again, everybody, for coming.
Thank you.
Again, please help me thank tonight's moderator, Justin Fenton. And tonight's author, oh my God, I had a brain fart, sorry. Jens Ludwig. And so now, if you have not purchased books already, now is your opportunity. Snug Books is outside. Selling books will be outside in around